Hello and welcome. If there was an award for the world's worst climate change policy, up until a couple of years ago, I would have said that Australia's safeguard mechanism absolutely deserved to take out that dubious honour. Introduced by the former government, the scheme applies to just over 200 of Australia's largest emitting facilities. But until the middle of last year, it was basically a complete flop. Firstly, it contained extraordinarily complex reporting requirements. Secondly, it was remarkably lacking in transparency. Thirdly, and most importantly, with only a few exceptions, it didn't actually require these 200 or so large emitters to cut their emissions. In fact, cumulative emissions from those covered by it actually grew a little. But early last year, things changed. The Australian Parliament passed a government bill that significantly overhauled the scheme, and those reforms kicked in on July 1 last year. The scheme is still complex, but most big emitting facilities must now reduce their net emissions by an average of 4.9% annually. Today I have two guests with me who I think of as the safeguard whisperers to talk us through how these changes are playing out on the ground. Thomas Hodgson and Dr. Franziska Curran are senior sustainability executives with global sustainability consultancy Anthesis. Both are based in Australia and they know the safeguard law and rules inside out. They've also spent a lot of time looking under the hood of the safeguard in their capacity as advisors to companies that are covered by it. So let's hear what they've got to say. And please, if you're covered by the safeguard mechanism, keep in mind that this information is general and is not financial advice. Hello, Thomas and Franziska. Thanks for joining me. First up, could you each tell me your actual job title? And could you each tell me what has been the project or action that you've been most proud of in your working life so far? Maybe Franziska, would you like to kick off?
It's great to be here. Love that intro. A bit harsh on the old safeguard mechanism, but perhaps true. So my name is Franziska Curran, and I'm a principal consultant based at Anthesis in Brisbane. My role is the service line lead of the decarbonisation and energy transition service line that we offer here in Australia. And predominantly that covers safeguard mechanism and large national greenhouse and energy reporting scheme clients. So we work on identifying emission reduction opportunities and helping clients to find a way there. I don't want to be too cheesy, but I think one thing I'm most proud about is the current team that we're in and the culture that we've cultivated around being supportive. You know, we work in really technically complex and high-paced work that can have, high ramifications and risks, but we are able to create a group that's really willing to jump in and help each other and be there for each other when things get tough.
Terrific. So, Thomas, over to you.
Thanks, Murray. And I guess firstly from my side, congratulations on the podcast. I think it's a great initiative. So my job title is the Australian Lead for Climate Resilience and Decarbonisation. So I work with Franziska and a number of other colleagues around Australia and interface directly with our global team to support large industrial clients on their carbon accounting, their establishment and planning towards hitting net zero targets, implementing large industrial decarbonisation. And it's been a real privilege to work in that space and ultimately in an area that I'm deeply passionate about. In terms of what's been the highlight of my working life so far, I think I like to really reiterate what Franziska has said around our current team. It's a great team of individuals, inspiring, sometimes a little bit intimidating in terms of the technical competence that they exhibit, but really a great team to be part of. I think going back though, I'm really proud of having been a part of the original carbon pricing mechanism, setting up clean energy regulators back in 2011, 2012 at the beginning of my career. And much of the success that we're now seeing with the current safeguard mechanism and the ACCU scheme can actually trace its history back to those early years and what of the lessons that we learned then. So great place to start my career. Really sad that it was in large part disassembled in 2014, but I think today we've got much of what was good about it and more to be proud of.
So first up, I'm going to ask each of you how you would score the Safeguard out of 10 in terms of its effectiveness as a decarbonisation strategy. Just a score first up, and then I'll come back to each of you to ask you to explain why you've given that score.
Okay, 8.5 out of 10.
8.5. That's a good score. Thomas?
It's 7.5.
7.5. I like to see that. A little bit of difference there. So we'll come back to you first up, Franziska. 8.5. Tell me why what are both the strengths and the weaknesses that have led you to give it that score?
It's really tricky. And I think you asked about its effectiveness. And I think that's a bit of crystal ball gazing. There's so many things that are going to change over the next couple of years. But in terms of being an instrument that tried to be equitable and efficient and simple, I think there were always going to be trade-offs. And in terms of being equitable, there's a lot of things built into it that are good, like starting from your current or historic emission intensity and converging on an industry average, as well as concessions for being trade exposed. I think there's a lot of good elements that we're making it flexible for heavy emitters to ramp up or start their decarbonisation journeys. I don't think it's very simple. And I guess if I was to pick one major criticism, I think we'll find out over the next few years whether it's actually incentivizing on-site decarbonisation or if people will be leaning much more into the use of offsets. And we know offsets are a really important part of the puzzle and essential for climate change, responding to climate change, but we definitely do need to decarbonise at source as well. So I'm excited. It was a big change from, as you've alluded to, a big change from what we had in the past.
Thanks very much for that, Franziska. And Thomas, if you could explain your score.
The 7.5, I guess, ultimately needs to reflect both the design and also the likely effectiveness. In terms of the design, I would have to say it's close to flawless, broadly speaking. Most things have been thought through, stakeholders have been effectively consulted in general, and the design is logically sound. The challenge that I have, though, is that considering that the safeguard mechanism is ultimately there to provide a driving force to decarbonise, I guess I fundamentally feel that the driving force that it's applying to industry is insufficient to drive the rate of change that is necessary for us to meet our decarbonisation challenges. And that's probably a necessary compromise because you want to minimise the pushback to such a scheme. And we saw what happened in the original carbon pricing mechanism when that wasn't sufficiently considered in the design and was overtly aggressive and generated a significant amount of pushback. With the current scheme, though, there is a sense that I have that it's not quite ambitious enough.
I wanted to follow up, and it really comes back a bit, I think, to your point, Franziska, which was about how we can't really tell how effective it's going to be at the moment. Next April, I think it is, we will have the first data coming out on how companies have responded to the first year of the reformed safeguard. What's your best guess of what we're likely to see in that data, and what will you be watching closely for?
There'll be noise in that data in the first year, but I am excited to see a bit more transparency and clarity around who will be generating safeguard mechanism credits and who will be using borrowing adjustments, as well as clarity in what methods will be used to estimate fugitive emissions by coal mining and oil and gas activities. This is the first year that the methods used by coal mine and oil and gas activities will be made public. And there are various methods that people use that have different levels of accuracy. And we're expecting facilities to use more and more accurate methods over time, but this will be the first year we'll see them all transparently.
Yeah, well, that's a really significant thing, especially because we had data come out from the Superpower Institute or via the Superpower Institute, I think just a few weeks ago, suggesting that methane emissions from 20 sites, top 20 methane emitting sites in Australia, could actually be, I think it was 10 times higher than what those sites have reported through ENGO. So that's quite an extraordinary difference, isn't it?
It is extraordinary. And I think these flow-on effects of more transparency and then more accuracy is something we can expect, but not in this reporting year, not by January, by April.
Thomas, did you want to add anything there on what you expect to see in the data and what you'll be looking out for?
I don't expect necessarily to see a huge amount of change in this first year. And part of the reason for that is that the prevailing price of ACCUs is broadly what it's been for a number of years now. And so if an organisation had in front of it a really great opportunity to decarbonise, it could have, prior to the current safeguard mechanism, implemented an ERF project and actually monetised that abatement. And so at the current carbon price, it's unlikely that there's projects and opportunities to decarbonise that are commercially compelling today that weren't commercially compelling historically. But at the margins, I suspect some organisations will certainly have taken the opportunity to implement decarbonisation initiatives, which might have been sitting on the back shelf, and that'd be great to see what happens there. In summary, I think I'm really excited to see the impact of the additional transparency that is going to come from the revised sort of data set.
Franziska mentioned the transparency on how emissions are reported by coal, oil and gas companies. Are there other elements of transparency that are notable?
I'd say that those are the key elements, alongside just one more data point in terms of emissions produced at the safeguard facilities. Just building on that existing and growing data set we've already got about the facilities and how they've responded to various policy mechanisms over the last number of years.
One more thing that will be published is if a facility has been able to have an adjusted decline rate, that will also be made public. And the way that people get an adjusted decline rate is through the trade exposed baseline adjusted measures, which is one of the flexibility and sort of one of the measures put in place in the design of the safeguard mechanism. And this is significant because it will show broadly or in a high level sense what the cost impact of the scheme is on what sectors. So if we see certain sectors applying for this trade exposed baseline adjusted, we call it TIBA status, that will give a good indication of the impact of the cost of the scheme on that particular sector.
Australia is committed to reducing emissions to 43% below 2005 levels by 2030. But early next year, it will set a new interim target for 2035. What ramifications will that have for the safeguard?
The 4.9% decline rate was obviously to get us from where we are to where we need to be by 2030. And the safeguard mechanism also has built into it what happens from FY30 onwards. And so they've built in a 3.285% decline rate for each year from then on. That line is a straight line from where we'll supposedly be in 2030 to net zero by 2050. If that 2035 target ramps up or is higher than expected, we can expect the 3.285% to be larger to draw a straight line between 2030 and 2035.
I think also it's good to reflect that the safeguard mechanism really only captures a modest subset of all emissions sources in Australia, with things like agriculture and power generation being excluded currently. And so the safeguard mechanism is just one tool in the toolkit to achieve the 2035 target. So how it contributes is a question for debate.
Thomas and Franziska will be back shortly with more great insights into the safeguard. Right now, we're going to hear from Mark Tilley, Asia Pacific Editor for international news services Carbon Pulse and Biodiversity Pulse. Hello and welcome, Mark.
Hi, Maury. It's great to be here.
One of the many things that you follow very closely, Mark, is what's happening in the Australian carbon credit unit market, known as the ACCU market. Could you tell us what you've observed about how that market is operating at the moment?
Yeah, sure, Maury. So it's pretty safe to say that there's never been so much interest in Australia's carbon market right now for several reasons, namely because of the safeguard mechanism, which is expected to be the main driver of demand in the market over the next decade or so. Emitters covered under the scheme are going to likely to need tens of millions of these credits, or Australian carbon credit units, or ACCUs as they're known, to meet declining emissions baselines. This is because rather than just reducing emissions directly at their facilities, many of these emitters, like mining companies, steel producers, and oil and gas companies, say that the technology they need to reduce their emissions, either does not exist yet or is unlikely to be deployed at scale until the end of the decade or well into the 2030s for some of the more trickier tech. So this is why the safeguard is expected to be such a massive driver of demand in this market. The government in November last year projected ACCU demand from the safeguard mechanism would go from around 1 million per year in 2022 to 26 million per year in 2030. But obviously, behind these credits are a set of approved methodologies or methods, which is what I want to focus on today. Methods are basically a list of activities that are supposed to remove or avoid CO2 from going into the atmosphere. One credit is claimed to represent 1 tonne of CO2 equivalent. So the Australian carbon market has 33 methods that are eligible to earn ACCUs. However, the market is dominated by credits that are based on just 3 of those, really. So that is the human-induced regeneration method, landfill gas, and avoided deforestation. Those 3 methods account for around 75% of the total of ACCUs that are traded in the market at this point in time. The thing is, though, is that 2 of those methods, HIR and avoided deforestation, have expired, and the landfill gas method is in the process of getting updated by the government. So what that means is that projects that use HIR or the avoided deforestation method can still generate ACCUs. However, no new projects coming into the system can use those methods. This is standard stuff about how these methods work, because they're supposed to have a shelf life and then get updated when more up-to-date science on how to best use and oversee these activities comes to light. Now, Labor government has been working for some time with industry groups, experts and others to come up with replacement methods to replace these expired ones, because obviously they know there's this wave of demand that is coming towards the market and they need to be ready for it. But it seems to be taking a bit longer than people have expected. So this is partly because of the independent review into the ACCU market that was conducted by former chief scientist Professor Ian Chubb in 2022, after a series of integrity issues were raised with the market and some of the methods, HIR included. Chubb found the scheme overall to be sound, but recommended a number of pretty substantial changes to the way the market is overseen and run, and that includes that method development be passed from the clean energy regulator over to the government. So, as with all of these intergovernmental processes, these things take time. There's also a certain amount of staff turnover and churn, which can naturally slow these processes down. That process of transferring that method development process over from the regulator to the government has taken place. But on the side of that, the method that's supposed to replace HIR is known as the Integrated Farm Land Management Method. And that's been in the works by industry groups and experts, etc., since 2019. So this method is designed to be modular, where several types of activities can be stacked on top of each other. But it appears quite technically tricky, as the industry stakeholders and experts who are working on it have yet to submit a draft version of the method to the market's oversight body, which is known as the Emissions Reductions Assurance Committee, or ERAC, for assessment. So the last we heard about this method is a 54-page discussion paper that came out in May, which said many of the parts of the method have been finalized, but some elements were still in active discussion. It was around that time the working group and the government said the draft method would be submitted by the end of the year. It's now coming up to November. We still haven't heard much about this. So we will see whether that remains to be the case. So the landfill gas method, meanwhile, is being updated by the government, and it released a consultation paper earlier this year listing options for the proposed method, the proposed changes, that it would choose to make to this method. However, we haven't really heard much about that since then either. Now, the government is working on several other methods that need to be replaced or updated. So the savanna fire management method, for example, or environmental plantings, all of which are expected to play a role in supplying credits to the market. So all of this stuff takes a lot of time.
It's a very time-consuming process, and it does seem to be something where timeframes have slipped quite a bit. I mean, do you see any signs that things are going to speed up, or do you think that there is an awareness of the need to get this sorted?
Well, I think there is a level of awareness about this, but also at the same time, people in the market are really wanting to know more about what is going on with these methods, because obviously they're a fundamental part of this process to create ACCUs that polluting companies under the safeguard will need to meet these emissions baselines.
Good.
Now, do you remember, Murray, the independent review that I mentioned earlier?
The Chubb review?
Yes. Yeah.
Yep.
So while all this is going on with the method, at the same time, the government is still working on changes to improve transparency and increase the standards, basically, of the scheme in line with the recommendations that Professor Chubb put forward. However, those themselves have been delayed, it seems, somewhat. The Climate Change and Energy Minister, Chris Bowen, was asked about these updates and legislative changes that needed to be made at a market event in July. And at the time he said, quote, that he wasn't going to pretend that this is government priority number one in the legislative agenda. So it seems to be like there's a bit of a challenge right now to bring these changes necessarily in time, because there's just this whole gamut of other legislation that is waiting to be passed, waiting to be drafted, waiting to sort of be developed, and that hasn't quite happened yet. So repeatedly when the government has been questioned about what its emissions reductions policies are, how the pollution from new coal mine extensions, for example, will be dealt with, they're consistently saying that these projects will be covered under the safeguard mechanism, or, we don't need something like a climate trigger, for example, because we have the safeguard mechanism. However, if you take companies who are covered under this mechanism at their word, and the safeguard mechanism at this stage relies entirely on ACCUs and the ACCU market, and that market is dependent on the methods, which are dependent on them obviously having integrity and being ready in time. But from what I've just described, it appears there's some pretty serious delays to those methods and preparing this market for a wave of demand that it has never faced before. The next surrender deadline for the safeguard mechanism for companies to surrender ACCUs to meet their emissions baselines is in the end of March next year. So there's not a huge amount of time. That being said, there is a backlog of ACCUs in the scheme, which is going to be used in the first few years of compliance. So it's not an immediately pressing issue, but obviously safeguards facilities have these emissions baselines that are falling every year by around 4.9%, which many have described as pretty aggressive. So there's this expectation that this backlog of ACCUs is going to pretty quickly flip into a deficit from around 2027. Analysts and banks are using phrases like mounting supply-side headwinds and tightening and finely balanced to describe conditions in the market. There's this freight train of demand coming, and it seems at this point in time like the government is still frantically laying the tracks ahead of it to be ready in time.
I like that analogy, and it's great.
As I said to you previously, the government's legislation is currently stuck in Parliament. So not much is getting done on that front. And that's partly because of what could be the biggest question hanging over this market at this stage, which is the federal election. The election is slated to be held before May next year. The opposition has yet to say whether they will keep the safeguard mechanism in its current settings or not. And as I said to you before, the safeguard mechanism and the ACCU market are inextricably linked. So if you change the safeguard, for example, so that the baselines aren't as aggressive or they aren't applicable or to have looser settings to it in some other form, then obviously the demand for ACCUs would be affected as a result of that. So the next 6 months are going to be pretty interesting.
Thanks so much, Mark. Those are great comments, and I look forward to talking again soon. And now back to Thomas and Franziska. Another relevant part of the puzzle is policy on Australian carbon credit units. What ramifications could carbon credit policy changes and ACCU market dynamics have for the safeguard?
So I think this is really where the magic of the safeguard mechanism comes into play, because it is so reliant upon the price of offsets. The higher the price of offsets, the greater the incentive to structurally decarbonise. And the lower the price of the offsets, the less the incentive to structurally decarbonise. At the moment, the signs are that the market's quite well supplied and will be for a number of years, which kind of reduces the likelihood there will be a breakout in pricing. And that suggests that a dramatic increase in industrial decarbonisation, for example, is less likely. However, there are a range of variables in play here where reliant on ACCUs, which can be traded in the market, can be used as a tool by investors and so forth to monetize and to take advantage of perceived changes in policy and other things. So some of that kind of activity could ultimately have a positive price impact and therefore drive acceleration in decarbonisation. But really, in my mind, the big thing to look out for, the biggest thing to look out for, is what the impact of the International Carbon Trading Framework will be. So that's a framework known as Article 6. And if that is enabled to its fullest extent, which would allow more or less unfettered trading of ACCUs on the international market, then you could see the price of ACCUs start to mirror some of the benchmarks in Europe and North America, which are quite significantly higher than the current benchmarks in Australia. And I guess that would sort of do two key things. One is that it would reduce significantly the number of entities seeking to produce and sell ACCUs for Australian consumption, and be seeking ultimately to have those ACCUs bought by overseas entities at a much higher price. And that in turn would then drive industrial decarbonisation in Australia, because the cost of not doing so is much higher, but also the risk of being exposed to an international market is also much higher. So the cost goes up, the risk goes up.
Are companies actually thinking about this?
Some companies are. And I've worked with a number of companies to do things like set an internal carbon price. And one of the reasons why a company would set an internal carbon price is to manage the risk of changing legislative risk drivers. So, for example, if ACCUs were traded internationally, on an organization's liability. And so an organization that's forward-looking might put a carbon price in internally, an internal carbon price, which would help it manage the possibility that these kinds of macro changes to the price of ACCUs could occur and believe they're potentially exposed. I think quite a few companies are looking at this, particularly the large oil and gas providers. And I think that's one of the reasons why you see them going out there and buying farmland and preparing to do their own nature-based projects as a way of insourcing or vertically integrating the supply of offsets. Or numbers today, it doesn't necessarily make a huge amount of financial sense, but in the context of the potential for ACCUs to be trading internationally, it makes a lot more sense, because some of those prices are dramatically higher than they are today.
Can I ask you, on the basis that international linking, full linking, would drive up the price of ACCUs, do you see it as a good thing, a good policy result, as a way of incentivizing more industrial decarbonisation?
it's not innately good, not innately bad. Fundamentally, we all share the same atmosphere, and the best way to decarbonize, in my view, is the one that's most economically rational, so the most cost effective. We only achieve and identify and pursue the most economically rational decarbonization when we have a globally linked cost of carbon that we all share. To that end, it's good. I think there's a lot of positive potential risks, though, because Australia, there could be a lot of industries that suffer if they're exposed without much notice to a global carbon price. So our manufacturing industry could suffer, a lot of employment opportunities could suffer, and that could ultimately drive negative pushback against the safeguard mechanism. So, there's, I think, a need for a lot of regulatory caution around some of these and what the implications could be.
Well, we've certainly been on that ride before with the carbon price scheme. Franziska, you mentioned earlier safeguard mechanism credits. There is that opportunity now for companies to earn and use or, sell or buy a new carbon abatement unit called a safeguard mechanism credit, or SMC. How is that different from an ACCU? And when do you think that SMCs will start to have a significant impact?
Safeguard mechanism credits, SMCs, are different from ACCUs in that ACCUs are designed to represent a ton of abated emissions, so removed, sequestered or avoided, but like a ton of tradable abated emissions, whereas the SMC rather represents an allowance to emit specifically for safeguard mechanism facilities. So if you come in under your baseline, you can generate safeguard mechanism credits. And if you come in over your baseline, you could procure ACCUs or safeguard mechanism credits to net out that exceedance. I suspect that anyone who is under their baseline at the moment and is able to generate safeguard mechanism credits after they know their position and they apply for them will possibly want to consider holding on to those for future liability if they expect they might face liability into the future. So I'm not sure there'll be too much trading of safeguard mechanism credits immediately, but we'll be able to see that in the coming years.
The safeguard mechanism at its heart is a cap and trade scheme, with the safeguard mechanism credits being enabling the trading component of the policy. I think there's as Franziska highlighted, a lot of organizations are probably at this point in time looking to bank any SMCs that they produce. So that general tendency going to, I guess, to a certain degree, undermine the function of a cap and trade scheme, which is to enable those organizations with lower cost decarbonization to sort of offset costs faced by those organizations with higher cost decarbonization, and ultimately make for a less cost effective, less efficient scheme overall.
I guess, though, it does, I take that point on the, that subdued trading might lead to less decarbonisation action overall, but it still provides an incentive, doesn't it, to go below baseline levels.
Really important part of the safeguard mechanism. We talk about decline rates and what a new NDC in 2035 could have, what the impact of that could be on those decline rates. But as of right now, there's fundamentally a financial incentive to reduce your emissions all the way to zero, if that was technically and commercially feasible, because if you did so, then you would generate a significant number of SMCs, which you could then monetize. So the question only is, how high is the price of those SMCs or ACCUs, and is it sufficient to drive decarbonization in a given industry?
The safeguard is due to be reviewed in 2027. If the climate minister at the time, whether it's Chris Bowen or Ted O'Brien, were to say, look, we're not going to do a formal review, we're just going to leave it to Thomas and Franziska to sort it out, what changes would you make? What are some of the key things that you would want to do?
Well, I think the biggest thing is in 2027, we'll see whether or not the safeguard mechanism will have a bite and whether the decline rate needs to be ramped up to support on-site decarbonisation. One thing I've been thinking about is how other bodies like the Science Based Target Initiative has looked at sector decarbonisation pathways and approaches and how different sectors can or should be able to decarbonise. And that has fed into what they think decline rates should be for a science-aligned or science-based target. Whereas the safeguard mechanism starts at the intensity of historic production and converges on an industry average as it was in the past with that 4.9% decline rate. But the ability of different industries to decarbonise is different. So I would wonder if part of the review that we would do in 2027 is considering differentiated decline rates based on what's technically possible, not just sort of where industry currently is at.
Because we will sort of have that data in a way, won't we? Because
we will. A lot of work is being done on that at the moment in the Australian context. So
that's interesting. That's an interesting idea. Thomas, given this ministerial instruction, get this scheme in tip-top shape, what would you be doing?
If there was a magic wand to do away with some of the practical implications of broadening the safeguard mechanism, and there isn't such a thing, in practical implications are really important to consider. But if we could do away with them momentarily, from an economy-wide Australian hitting its net zero 2050 target perspective, it'd be fantastic to see the safeguard mechanism sort of dramatically expanded to account for things like agriculture and electricity production and land use change. That's unlikely for a range of practical reasons. So in the absence of that, I think something that consideration being given to moving facilities down to the 25,000 tonne threshold, and everyone needs to contribute towards Australia hitting its net zero targets. And also the practical reality is that if only large businesses are decarbonising, fundamentally small business could get left behind because they'll be continuing to rely upon older, outdated technology and so forth.
What you're referring to there is that currently you're only covered by the safeguard if you've got a facility that emits 100,000 tonnes a year. And there are a lot of people who say it should be 25,000 tonnes. I just want to ask you one more safeguard question. And it's a bit sort of, juvenile, I guess, in a way. But when you go and talk to companies about the safeguard, what are the range of responses that you see? I mean, is there some where there's just fear in their eyes and some where they just kind of, consider it completely irrelevant to their decarbonisation agenda? And what's the sort of standard response, I guess, that you encounter?
Really in contrast to the observations I made back in 2012, 2013 in the original carbon pricing mechanism and the frequent observation of actual terror in the face of businesses who are just unprepared for the cost implications of that scheme, particularly given that it applied to 100% of emissions down to relatively small facilities, so 25,000 tonnes. This time around with the safeguard mechanism, I haven't observed that same kind of fear, and I think that speaks to the fact that this scheme has been better designed, better communicated, and that there's many more mechanisms to decarbonise than there were 10 years ago. I don't see many businesses who are too trepidatious about it, but neither do I see many businesses that are seeing it as a real and genuine driver to really aggressively decarbonise more than they kind of already were. And so sort of suggests that the scheme is seen as, at this point in time, something more akin to a light touch that has potential in the future, but today that potentially hasn't yet been realised.
The tricky question to answer, I can't say I've seen fear in the eyes of safeguard mechanism covered facilities. And I think rather it's more like an idea of just getting on with it. Like, okay, well, we have to do this now. How do we do this? And what do we need to know to do this? How do we make use of any flexible arrangements? How do we report our emissions more frequently so we can better track liability? It's sort of an understanding of that. And I think becoming more organised, getting on with it and becoming more organised will eventually translate into more streamlined identification of emission reduction opportunities, both operational and project-based. So I think, I'm feeling a sense of people now understand. They see that there's a pathway ahead they're going to have to ramp up and are getting ready, getting prepared for that.
Just one final question, which is not about the safeguard. To close, could each of you share with us, one fact that you think isn't sufficiently known that is important as we try to find a way forward to a net zero, nature positive and better future?
I think fundamentally, the fact that isn't that well known is that Australia is just so well placed. Decarbonisation is a huge opportunity for Australia because we're just so well endowed with natural resources, with wind and sun, that as the world decarbonises and we decarbonise, actually we're going to become increasingly cost competitive with many of our competitors because we have just huge untapped potential in terms of renewable energy. So it's a really bright future for Australia.
I'm going to indulge a bit and have two, if that's okay. I was reading the quarterly essay not that long ago, Highway to Hell, and there was one fact that really struck me in there. Researchers were looking into the conditions that happened around the Black Summer, so the 2019-2020 fire season, and they concluded that if emissions continue to grow, the conditions of that year would be considered average by 2040 and exceptionally cool by 2060. I think what that tells me is how real it is, and it's useful to have a tangible reminder instead of this lofty long-term could be the end of the century. Other thing that I think is important to remember is that the wheels are so firmly in motion, and I was speaking to a friend who went to the Nature Positive Summit just a couple of weeks ago, who was saying that the way we're organising around nature is much quicker and more streamlined than climate. And so it'll just be a matter of time before it is business as usual to be reporting on and making progress towards being nature positive, as well as, our strong net zero future. So I feel like there's a lot of momentum that will help us move away from the stark statistic that I shared immediately before that.
Terrific. Well, that's a nice up note. In fact, we've got two positive statements sandwiched by one horrific statistic. Thanks very much to both of you for talking about the safeguard today. There's been some wonderful insights there. That's it for today. I hope you've enjoyed the podcast, and see you again next time. Bye.